Simon, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Andy, it's an honor and pleasure to be with you. I love your podcast and what you're doing. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience. So I'm a British American, I guess now, Andy. In 2022, became an American citizen after living in the US for 11 years. Former UK police officer, most of my career focused on organised crime as a detective and then detective sergeant in a very busy sort of police department just west of London. So we had around sort of 4,000 sworn officers, 3 or 4,000 support staff, so large sort of police department there. And like I said, most of my time was spent in and around covert investigations, organised crime. I emigrated to the US here in 2011, where I was head of counterterrorism at Mall of America, Minnesota. So I've always been in very high stressful situations. It must just be in my makeup. And I was there for 3 years overseeing counterterrorism. A lot of sort of connections with federal and local law enforcement, a lot of information sharing, but primarily I focused on the behavior detection unit, which in the
Mhm.
corporate world is actually very unique. There's a lot of people doing it more now than what they were when the mall started. So that is a team of highly trained security practitioners that go looking for behaviors that are outside of baseline in the shoppers at the mall. And then when they see those behaviors outside of baseline, they engage them to try and work out what's the intent behind what I've seen. Everything we see around behavior, we need to really understand, well, what's the intent, what's the meaning. So I was there for just short of 4 years doing that, and then moved into financial risk compliance, working at large organizations, US Bank, Wells Fargo, overseeing a lot of financial risk and compliance. So I've done a lot of different things, Andy, and Kingswood Security Consulting is where I am now, and it's an organization that I started, and primarily we focus on non-profits and how's the worship, because that's a real strong passion of mine, is helping and supporting people and organizations where security might not necessarily be their sort of primary function, but helping them through that risk, how to sort of manage it, how to mitigate it. So that's a little bit about me. That's the elevator pitch, Andy, for your listeners.
Yeah, and you talked about being at the Mall of America, and for those of you who don't know, the Mall of America is like a park for at Disney World. It's enormous, so it is no small feat to be in security and taking up that sort of a task. That's got to be huge. But one of the things that caught my attention when you were talking about that is looking for behaviors outside of the baseline. That is something that my audience is very attuned to. So I will ask you a little bit more about that as
Yeah,
we
sure.
go. But what you kind of said a little bit more about this when you're talking about helping nonprofits, but what led you to a career in law enforcement? What was it that inspired you to say, I need to do more to help my community? What was it that led you to
Yeah.
that?
And it's funny how it all came about. So I can recall, so what I should say for your listeners as well, I don't know if I told you this, Andy, but I joined the police when I was 19, which was very, very young. I think I did my first undercover course when I was 21, became a detective. I think I was 22, 23. I think more likely 23. So very young, had a very high rise in my career early on. But I was around 14 when, you used to watch the cop shows on TV and stuff. And you think, oh, that's really interesting. I might want to do that. And interestingly, when I was sort of 18, so I didn't go to like the traditional 4 year college that you might have here in the US. When I was 18, I actually applied for the police in England, and I was working in community care for adults with learning disabilities, Down
Mhm.
syndrome, and sort of cognitive ability. And we were in a community home, so these adults were living in the community, and the next door neighbor to this house was a very senior ranking within the police. And me and him were just talking one day, and he said, "Simon, is this what you're going to do with your life? What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I've actually applied for the police." And he said, "Well, my office is next door to the recruitment department. Let me go and talk to them and find out where your application is." And then I think like 2 or 3 days later, I don't know what he said, Andy, but I mean, a bit of influence was used, but I had a letter come back saying, you've passed the application stage, sort of come in for testing. And within sort of within a year, 15 months, I was then serving as a police officer. But I think I always knew, and as part of my journey, Andy, that I sometimes talk about, that my parents separated before I was born, never met my father. I had a little sort of validation issues and trying to find my place in the world. And joining the police at 19 was really, really good for me because I'd never had this father figure in my life. And it actually put a lot of more mature men that actually
Mm.
were guiding me on decisions. And it was only later when I sort of got into my 30s and sort of long left the police, but actually realized that, these men saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And so they were really guiding me through my career. And a lot of these men were very instrumental in my success in the police. And that's something that I've gone on to do in my own work now, is try to see things in people that might not necessarily see in themselves, and take that same type of mentality of paying it forward. So I think I was most probably always destined to be in and around a protector role, albeit I sort of fell into a little bit by default. So that's sort of part of my journey as to how I ended up within law enforcement.
Very cool. Very cool. So, you talk about immigrating to the United States, and you're working for the Mall of America. Tell us a little bit more about your job there.
Yeah, and so you sort of touched on it. So for people that may have heard of the Mall America but don't actually have never been there before, so it's around 6 million square feet. So it's
Oh, it's
Ar it
tiny.
well, it's small, yes. Arguably, it's one of the largest attractions in the US, and here's why,
Mhm.
Andy, because it actually is free to get in. So generally, they get around 42, 40 million, 44 million visitors per year, free to get in. It has its own zip code. When some people, they've had a few recent gun incidents at the mall, but they've been in existence 30 years. So you look at the crime data, they do very well. People say, well, is the mall a safe place? When I was there, I don't know what they're up to now, but there was over 100 security officers patrolling the mall, working at the mall, and the police department have officers inside. And it's a
Mhm.
little known fact, because the mall has its own zip code, there's more security and there's more police officers inside that building than the actual city that it rests in. So, when journalists and people to talk to me, I say, we've got to get this into perspective. In that 6 million square feet, there's more security than in the entire city of Bloomington that it sits.
Mhm.
So, it's a very comprehensive security program in there. A lot of great work goes on there, and it was an interesting role. I mean, like I said, I mean, it could be stressful. There's a lot of nuances to working in a large organization like that, because when we look at the safety and security side, Andy, we're not just saying, well, the mall has to keep people safe. Well,
Mhm.
of those, in that 6 million square feet, there's sort of 700 stores. So those 700 stores that are tenants of the mall, you got to try and work and collaborate with them to buy into the security culture, that everyone in the
Mm.
mall takes
Mhm.
security
Mhm.
incredibly seriously. Whether it's the CEO walking and sees an unattended item, or a housekeeper sees something out of place, everyone is trained to have that strong culture. We have to stop, we have to look, we have to observe, we have to be inquisitive and ask questions. And I think what the mall's done really well is trying to get that same type of buy-in from their stores as well, where this isn't just the mall's responsibility, the 600 stores, how many are in there these days, it's also their responsibility to make sure that they're training their staff, they're educating their staff, and they know the more procedures to keep everyone safe. So I think when you look at the crimes that have occurred, I think they're minimal when you bear
Mhm.
in mind they've been in existence for 30 years and there's 40 million people going into there every year. Yeah, it's a robust program. What else do you want to know, Andy? Whatever inside scoop you want?
Sure. So what I thought was interesting is you talked about you had, and I think a lot of people just assume that stores buy into security because, why wouldn't they want to? But that's a good point that you have brought up, is that not everybody always wants to buy into the security aspect of where they are. So how do you convince people to say, hey, being safe is actually in your best interest? How do you talk to people that way?
Yeah, and in today's time, so when I wrote my book, Secure Church Operations, which is church focused, but it's really applicable to business. One of my goals is to
Sure.
translate Secure Church Operations into a business. And a journalist actually asked me this recently, Andy. But she said to me, "Why is it that retail stores seem to be more open to talk about the crime that they're having, the issues that they're having, the sort of antisocial behavior, the thefts?" She said, "Why is it that stores are being more open and going on the news and sharing with their customers where they're at with their journey?" And I said, my opinion, supporting clients at Kingswood in the retail, is that they realize it in today's modern world. they have to be transparent and they have to say, this is where we are, this is what we're trying to do to help you. Because as consumers, we have access to more public information than ever before.
Hmm.
So an organization has to come out and say, we are safe for these reasons, we are taking these steps. Otherwise, shoppers can vote with their feet and, well, I don't feel safe
Yeah.
at this West Mall,
Hmm.
I don't feel safe at this North Mall, so I'm not gonna go there. So I think society has put more pressure, perhaps, in the right direction on stores where they've had to acknowledge where we are in society, where there's a lot of mental illness, crime is on the rise, a lot of public disorder. They've had to acknowledge this and lean into it and take positive steps to try and change their culture. Otherwise, we're seeing not only in the news reputational risk, but we're also seeing huge lawsuits afterwards.
Hmm.
I work with a lot of organizations, Andy, where they get a lot of threats by former employees, or they could have a threat which comes into their organization. In today's world, a company has to acknowledge that threat, and they have to do a threat assessment and work out what is the risk to our organization from this ex-employee saying he's going to come and shoot the place up, or he's going
Right.
to come and hurt someone. So there's just a lot more accountability, if that makes sense, Andy. I think
Hmm.
on stores, which is why we're seeing this changing culture, right? I mean, we can vote with our feet and we can vote with our fingers as to where we go. So they have to demonstrate to us that we take security seriously. And when you're inside our establishment, we're going to look after you, because otherwise people vote with their feet and go somewhere else in today's world.
Right. You brought that up, and I'm so glad that you did. And, the focus of our conversation today really is going to be on protecting houses of worship, of churches.
Yeah.
And so you said very clearly people are going to vote with their feet. If people don't feel safe in a house of worship, they're not going to show up. And I will say that, I'm on my church security team. That's a shocker, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
But we live in a transitioning neighborhood that, has more crime that happens, not usually on Sunday morning when we're there, but our particular team has had to say, okay, we're going to take a much more visible presence. We're going to let people know that we're here. We're going to start educating people more so that we can attract more people to be here. So tell me, when looking at a holistic approach in church safety and security, how important is it that people feel safe where they're worshiping?
Yeah, I think we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that there were some parts of our community that didn't feel safe and they didn't come to church. And then when they
Mhm.
don't come to church, the offering might go down. If the offering goes down, we can't then do the ministry work. If we can't then do the ministry work, we're not really doing the sort of the work of the church. So there's this sort of big sort of cycle around this. And I think, to answer your question, Andy, I think it's very similar to where a lot of schools are coming from as well, where
Mhm.
when you're inside maybe not a large public venue, but when you're inside a place of mass gathering, what we know that in today's world, that active shooter incidents are still incredibly rare. I want to make sure that people understand that. I think
Yep.
in the
Yep.
US, there's around 17,000 murders by gun crime every year, but there's been 188 mass shootings since 1966. So still
Mhm.
incredibly rare. But there's still that risk there. So I think the need for people to feel safe, knowing in a church, particularly Andy, that we are a house of brokenness. We could be sat
Mhm.
next to someone who has a
Right.
sexual addiction. We could be sat next to someone who's
Yeah.
just been released from prison. We could be sat next to someone who's murdered someone. They come and seek forgiveness. We could be sat next to someone who's embezzling church funds. So um, in a house of worship, all those people are welcome because we believe that we can lead them to the Lord and there's no sin that our Lord can't forgive. But there's a lot of risk in various different groups that come to church.
Mhm.
So I think, again, people are aware of the need to keep safe. There's a certain element of accountability. And I really encourage houses of worship to really understand their holistic risk.
Mhm.
What are those things that could go wrong? And then how are we then going to respond to them when we're in the moment?
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate your mini sermon there in response to that question.
Yeah.
That's good. All right. So
There's no
what
short answer with me, Andy. You'll learn that.
and that's fine. As long as
Yeah,
it's all relevant as it's been so far, we're good, man. We're
there you
good.
go. Very good. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Tony Blauer or not, but I've had him on the show, and when I ask him a question, he gives me an entire college course answer
Yeah.
to the question, and I appreciate that because he's like, you know, I see this with you, Simon. Like you're asking me a question, I'm going to make sure you fully understand what I'm saying. So I
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that.
What?
So all right, with the average church congregation, you know, we'll say just in the United States because it's obviously different, you know, wherever you go in the world.
Yeah.
What considerations does every congregation need to really take into account to protect itself?
So I think every congregation, and we'll sort of go a little bit wider if that's okay, Andy, as a church.
Sure.
I think every congregation, every church needs to understand what are the risks? What are those what can go wrong questions? And I've
Hmm.
touched on some of them around, protecting our children. Jesus said,
Yep.
"Let the children come to me." Do we? What are the risks around our children? Do we have the controls in place to try and mitigate those or prevent harm to our children? When we look at our service, Jesus was preaching in a synagogue when a man was possessed and started shouting out. Well, if Jesus can be preaching in a synagogue and someone interrupted him, could that happen to your pastor when they're preaching on Sunday morning? Yes, it could.
Yeah.
Well, again, what do you want that answer to look like? A lot of people will come to say to me, and I don't want to go down that gun rabbit hole, Andy, because it's a big one. But
Yeah.
churches will say, well, do we need do we need a security team that carry firearms? Well, we know that there's an increase in deadly force in the house of worship. Already at the time of recording this podcast, we've almost tripled all crimes against house of worships committed in the prior year. We're only 4 months into the year.
Mm.
If deadly force does come inside your house of worship, what do you want your response to be? Let's talk that through. So I think we need to look at risk holistically, and then there's the church funds,
Hmm.
embezzlement, there's programs. We have divorce care clinics. Most of us men don't often go to divorce care clinics because we don't want to admit we've got a problem. So predominantly they're women that go to these
Yeah.
divorce care clinics. So is it possible that ex-husband or a soon-to-be divorced husband who is
Yeah.
angry with his wife, who wants to find his wife, might turn up to Wednesday night divorce care and try and find her? If you're
Hmm.
running divorce care during the day, is it possible that husband who's agitated and angry might come during the day to find her? Yes, it is. So it's really one of the steps I always encourage houses of worship to do, and then I think you might have read this in my book, is really try and understand what is your universe of all the things that you're doing.
Hmm.
And then there is no secure, even though we're on the Secure Dad podcast, there's secure, there's safer. So once
Hmm.
you identify all your universe, you really then say, well, what can we do on each of those programs to get 1% safer than what we were yesterday? And so it's really looking at the church body, because we're trying to help the community, is understanding our risk and then trying to do what we can each day to make sure we're managing or mitigating that risk in a better way. Does that help, Andy?
Yes, it does. So I'll ask you this. I think
Please,
there's
yeah.
a lot of church security teams that are out there and they're just completely passive and they're just not going to do anything until, you know, something goes bang. So how important is it that church security teams and really staff and even members be proactive in safety?
Yeah, I mean, I often say, being proactive is what saves the day. If I go
Hmm.
type back to the program I ran at Mall of America, it can be a little bit of a controversial program, but it's designed on behaviors. And if we tied into a house of worship, God gave us feelings, He gave us emotions. When we feel in a certain way, I encourage church safety teams to say, not am I being biased? Am I being prejudiced? Am I being racist? Think back to your emotions. What is God trying to communicate to me in this moment? Why are
Hmm.
the hairs standing up on the back of my head? Why is my mouth getting all dry? Why are my hands getting all warm and clammy? What is God trying to communicate to me? And He's more than likely saying to you, this is danger. I mean, I can't remember the number,
Hmm.
but the human eye sees like 36 different shades of green because we're designed to see our predator, in the sort of fields walking towards us. So when you have that mentality, in a church where we can be an open and warm environment, it's really once you see something, the old government see something, say something. When you see something, is leaning into that, because most often, Andy, most often this is going to be no harm whatsoever.
Right.
And it's an
Right.
opportunity to lean out to your community. Welcome. My name's Simon Osamoh. I'm on the safety team here at Westwood Community Church. I haven't seen you here before. What brings you here today? Pause, listen. My
Hmm.
name's Simon. I'm on the safety team. Really excited that you're here at church. I haven't seen you before. How can I help you today? Pause, listen. I'm
Hmm.
asking open-ended questions that require an answer, and I'm doing it in a very community-spirited way where they don't really know. I'm trying to work out, well, who are you and what are you doing here? They just
Right.
see me as
Right.
they just see me as a nice person of the church who's asked them an open question, trying to work out why they're there, but I can listen to that information. So the reason why being proactive is so important is because that's how we get to someone's intent.
Hmm.
Sometimes teams will
Hmm.
come to me and say, "Oh, there's a person with a backpack inside the church." Well, is that a problem? Oh, there's someone with a gun inside the church. Well, is that a problem? The question is, what's their intent with that firearm? Is that
Hmm.
a lawful permit to carry holder who either doesn't know you've got a no firearm
Right.
policy
Right.
or has forgotten to leave on? If they never intend to use that firearm,
Hmm.
because they're an IT worker and responsible firearms person. What's the concern? So how are we going to get to find out who he is? Someone's got to approach him. You've got to lean into this conversation, introduce yourself, and try and work out. But what's the intent behind behind what I see? More often, Andy, he's going to say, "I just left my gun on by mistake. Sorry, I
Right.
didn't realize you had a no gun policy." Or you say, "Can you take it to your car?" He says, "Absolutely." So is that really small percent where someone actually says, well no, or gets into a gunfight. So that's what's so important to be proactive, because being proactive is what saves the day, and it leads you to the intent rather than assuming, making assumptions. No, we need to know.
Hmm.
I
Right.
know why he's got that firearms on him because of this reason.
Right, right. And so what I also hear, you've also written a very good book on de-escalation that I'm actually reading right
Mm.
now, and that I have actually already used practical tips from it. What's the role in de-escalation when it comes to a security team at a house of worship? I mean, I hear you saying
Yeah.
you need to know, you need to get more information. Kind of walk us through. I appreciate you giving us, like, how to start that conversation. Walk us through some de-escalation tips for church safety.
Yeah. So the reason why de-escalation is important is the role of a church safety team is to be proactive. But as you yourself know, Andy, it's also to raise your hand and say, "I'll go first."
Right,
There,
right.
there's a person who's outside of baseline behavior. I'll go first. I'll lead into it. There's a husband and wife having an argument in the church parking lot because they're going through a messy divorce. I don't know if there's
Yeah.
necessarily a good divorce, and the young child's there crying, and husband and wife are shouting and screaming at each other. I'll go first. So we have this mentality of I'll go first, meaning I'm going to walk myself into the situation. So there's two components to this. The church needs to make sure they've got the right people, they're training them in the right way. And then that safety practitioner who's volunteering their time, most often in churches, these are volunteers, they need to ask themselves, do I have the skills for what is needed? And I think if you can hit unusual behavior, suspicious behavior, medical, conflict de-escalation, and you got some confidence in asking the right questions, you've pretty much nailed the top four things, Andy, that
Hmm.
are going to help you. So conflict de-escalation is something that we need to be trained with, and we're going to see within house of worship, because the reason why we're a flashpoint for brokenness. What comes with brokenness? Conflict. So that's part of the reasons why teams need to acknowledge they need to get better at conflict de-escalation. And one of the best ones that I like to use, and actually, I don't know if this is in the book, Andy. You have to remind me if it is. But when I was sort of a 19-year-old uniformed police officer, I would go around to domestics at people's houses where I'd have people in their 40s and 50s and they're arguing.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
I would step in and I would introduce myself and say, "Look, do you need this 19-year-old rookie police officer to sort of to tell you how it sorts out?" And that would definitely make them stop and stop and
Hmm.
take notice. But that's when I really started to use options, and then I know you
Hmm.
read this in the book, and I think you like this one. And so, an option-based approach is a way to empower the person to resolve the situation themselves, where they take ownership. So the
Hmm.
example I gave in the book is that when I was director of risk and compliance, I was working for a company, and I walked through a break room, and there
Hmm.
was a woman who had her hands in her head, and she was deeply
Yeah.
distressed, and I was running late thinking, can I engage now or can I not? And I came back a couple of hours later, and she was still sat there. And I spoke to the HR manager and said, why is this female here? And they said, well, we've terminated her, and she's refusing to leave. And I said, well, why is she refusing to leave? And I said, well, I don't know. She's been in now for 3 hours. She's not leaving. So I went over. Cut a long story short, introduced myself. We went to a side room. I took a female with me, being protected as a man. And I
Right.
just had a
Right.
conversation with her. She spoke for 30, 40 minutes, got everything off her chest that she wanted to say. I gave some verbal prompts, paraphrased back, gave a few to show that I was listening. And then after 40 minutes, when she had said everything that she wanted to say, interrupted, I then said, what I can't change today is the fact that you've been terminated. But what I can change is how you leave here. One
Mm,
option is that I
hmm.
call you an Uber, takes you everywhere you go. One option is I drive you to the bus stop, I'll pay, and I'll wait with you while the bus arrives. The third option is that you're refusing to leave. I'm going to have to call law enforcement. They're going to come arrest you, trespass you. Not only is it going to be a bad end to working here, but also it might prevent you from working somewhere else in the future. I didn't
Hmm.
push her. I didn't pull her. I said to her, which one of those options would you like to do? And I think most of the audience always say, she went with the Uber Andy. Within 5 minutes, she had left. And then human resources said, Simon, that was amazing. What did you do? And I said, well, I didn't really do anything. I listened. I gave her some options, empowered her to make a decision. And then she then left the building. So that's something that a church safety team could really try to use and capitalize, is giving someone options who's in a
Hmm.
crisis, empowers them to make the decision themselves. And again, maybe we'll talk about left brain, right brain a bit later, but that's really how useful de-escalation can be. And most often you're just sitting back and just allowing them to make the decision. Which one of these options would you prefer, knowing that her brain is going to drift more towards the sort of logic side, because, well, yeah, if I do get arrested, I'm not going to be able to get any job in the future. So maybe I'll just
Right.
walk out the door here and have this conversation for another day.
Yeah, and that was a really good story. I mean, you let off your de-escalation book with that, and that immediately hooked me in being able to say, okay, let somebody, have their say. They don't necessarily want their way; they have their say.
Mm.
I learned that from Greg and Brian over at Arcadia Cognerati, and just listen to them, have them explain what's going on, and I like how you give them options. And I'm sure the whole time that she was talking, you were coming up with those options. You didn't necessarily
Yes,
walk into the room knowing, oh, I know exactly how everything's going to go. I know how everything I'm going to say, and it's going to work perfectly. You were building that as you were listening to her, being a very active listener. Um,
absolutely.
and so I think a lot of times when people are on security, they think, oh, I can shoot really well or I can fight. So therefore, I'm on security. And those people only see the solutions as being either fighting or shooting. Whereas you here are taking a much more human approach and saying there's a whole lot more things that we can do besides creating more conflict, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that, and there's another story I'll cut short as well for your podcast, is about remembering in conflict de-escalation. This isn't about you, this is about them. And some of your
Mm-hmm.
listeners might not know that not only my English, I'm black English as well. And when I was in my time in law enforcement, I would have people that are drunk, or they're on some type of drugs, and they're saying horrible things about my ethnicity. And some people
Mm-hmm.
might get really, agitated and worked up by that. But I would very early on say to myself, Simon, this isn't about you. This is about them. It doesn't matter who you are. I've got nothing to do with this. This
Right.
person has a problem. So, don't when you're trying to de-escalate, don't make it about you. This is about them. And actually, one of the sort of funny stories, if you like, some of your listeners might not realize that routinely a lot of police officers in the UK still don't carry firearms. A lot more now
Right.
have tasers and other weapons, but because guns are outlawed, we don't expect to see guns every day on the street. So when I was a uniformed officer, I didn't have a firearm, and I stopped a person that used to be the European kickbox champion 2 o'clock one morning, and he got out of his car and he's bouncing like he's going to roundhouse me. And I'd
Mm-hmm.
stopped him because his brake light was out, and he wanted to escalate, get into a fight and a conversation. And I just said to him, Andre, I said, your brake light is out, get it fixed in the morning. No more questions. And I just turned around and started to walk back to my car. And his entire look was like, what just happened? This should have been a fight. This should have been an argument. But I
Mm-hmm.
treated him like I would do with someone else. It was a brake light. Did I need to start roundhousing and fighting? Well, I mean, I would have lost, Andy, I can tell you. But
Oh,
I
sure. Oh,
need,
for sure. Yeah.
yeah, but did I need to start rolling around the floor at 2 o'clock in the morning with someone over a brake light? So it's really
Right.
important to me. Yeah, it's not about me. It's not about how I'm going to respond. It's how they're going to respond. So just leave it with them. This isn't about you. This is about them. And be take the upper hand. It's okay to walk away and save it for another day. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you don't want to pick a fight with a kickboxing champion,
No,
no
yeah,
matter.
I would have lost bad. By the time I pressed on rage to get help, I mean, my head would have mostly been spinning around in a 360 spin. Yeah, yeah.
Right,
That
right.
was a funny time. Funny time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I'm glad you can laugh about it now. That's good.
I couldn't at
Um,
2 o'clock in the morning, but now I can do. Yeah.
yeah, that's that's good. So, when looking at a house of worship, what's the balance that we need to find with creating a welcoming environment versus a secure one? Because we don't,
Right.
obviously we don't want to put a fence and razor wire around our church to keep the bad
Yeah.
people out. Whatever. Where's the balance? What do we need to look for?
Yeah. I think the balance is found between the denial of danger, the security culture, and having the awareness that bad things and crimes can happen. So I think telling you a story about 2017 at the First Baptist Church, Sutherland Springs, Texas. I interviewed
Yeah.
Frank Pomeroy, the former pastor of that church.
Hmm.
He wasn't at church the day when 26 people in his community died. One of those
Right.
was 14-year-old daughter. The night before, he was at dinner, and someone asked him at dinner, when I think he was in Oklahoma, and that person said, "Frank, are you concerned about safety and security at your church?" And he just said, "We're a small church in Texas. Nothing is ever going to happen here." The following day, the very
Oh.
next day, 26 people in his community, including his daughter, were killed. So I think the middle is like the denial of danger. So we've got to understand that bad things will happen in the world, and bad
Hmm.
things will find their way into house of worship. Let's in this current year, let's take that as a given that we're no longer immune. We used to be
Hmm.
sanctified places,
Right.
untouched. No criminals would come in, but we're not there anymore. So we need to readily accept that we're not there, and that crime is going to come into our churches, so we can remove the denial. And then I think the sort of the intersection then is just what we spoke about earlier, having that sort of what I call conversational interviewing on my course is just making sure that we welcome all individuals, we understand the risk, we're being proactive, we're trying to find the intent, but at the same time, we're prepared to take action if we see behaviors that are escalating that might cause people harm, because we can't have denial. A good friend of mine, Carl Chin, is a similar to me, a nationally known church safety practitioner. He still travels around the country. And when I say to him, "Carl, what are you seeing?" He still says denial of danger. So
Mm.
we've got to remove that and just say, let's welcome everyone, but find a place for them. But we've always got to be a little bit, I think, was it Ronald Reagan over here, perhaps, that said, "Andy, trust but verify." Um,
Yeah.
we, we have to have a little bit of that element in the church because of the type of people that we're helping. There was a church here in Minnesota where they had a divorce care clinic during the day, and they had a prisoner rehabilitation program run at the same time. They didn't know one of those former prisoners was a convicted sex offender. He follows an attractive blonde, blue-eyed woman into the restroom where he rapes her. There
Ugh.
was there was a lack of understanding here as to, we want to welcome everyone, but there has to be a boundary. And I think maybe boundary is the good word I'm trying to get to
Yes.
here, Andy, is to
Hmm.
and each church needs to work out for themselves what is that boundary, understanding that that side of the law can be very thin. So I think finding the boundary which fits with your church security culture and your church mission is mostly what churches need to do to be able to have that intersection between a safe and welcoming place, but also performing their obligation and biblical obligation to keep people safe. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
It does. It does. I like the term of boundaries because when we can define our boundaries as people, as a family, as a church congregation, we're going to be able to respond a whole lot better once we know a boundary has been broken or somebody has encroached on one, what their intent might be. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, and
phenomenal.
actually, and I worked with a pastor actually only last year where someone within their community was sort of having suicidal thoughts and
Hmm.
sort of wanting to perhaps cause harm to others, and and the pastor was talking to me, and I said that's fine. I said he's no longer welcome at your church in a respectful way, how can we minister him? And me and that pastor agreed that every Tuesday he was going to meet him at a coffee shop, public place, and he was going to go through a sermon with him one on one because he wanted to minister this person with mental illness.
Hmm.
But when
Hmm.
someone's saying, I want to take my life and the life of others, I have to strongly say to him, the boundary is he can't then come to a place of mass gathering if he's saying he wants to harm other individuals, because we're
Hmm.
not then looking after those individuals. So we found another way to minister him was for a pastor to meet him at a coffee shop on a Tuesday and walk him through the sermon, and at the same time he can then lead him on his mental illness path. So I mean, that's a great example of how we can have a boundary to say no, but it's a no, and there's another way we're going to help this person.
Right, right. Well, let me ask you something. Do you mind if I kind of give you a scenario and maybe you kind of walk me through some of
Yeah,
your thought
absolutely.
process? And
Yes, yeah, do.
I am ambushing you here, and I don't like to do this to my guests, but I feel like you have the experience to handle this. Being on my church security team, one of the scenarios that I've run through that I'm not sure I would know personally how to handle is if I see a group of people forming outside my church that I think are coming to protest. Maybe my church hasn't done anything. Maybe they're just a Christian organization and there are people there who just want to take videos. They just want to socially disrupt a church congregation for whatever reason. I see this starting to develop in the parking lot. What is something that me and my team can do that would keep these folks from coming in and disturbing what's going on? What kind of guidance can you give me?
Yeah, and you're ambushing me, and I've had this question before, and that is a really good question in today's modern world. And I had that a couple of years ago with an Episcopal church. They were having a speaker who wasn't political, but it's sort of what he spoke about was getting quite political, and it's about
Sure.
Islamophobia. And he was
Mm,
a speaker talking about how sort of Muslim is sort of being portrayed in this negative light by the media.
sure.
Some people, fanatics, don't like Muslims or don't like Islam, this type and the other. And we knew that because he was a controversial speaker coming,
Hmm.
we knew that he has protesters that were going to come.
Right.
And so I spoke to the priest beforehand in Episcopal Church, and I spoke to him and said, let's consider this. You've invited him to a church to talk on this subject because the media portraying Islam in a bad light. You don't agree with that, and you want to allow him the opportunity to speak. However, there's people that don't agree with what he's going to talk about. If protesters come to a church, what does that look like in
Hmm.
relation to either letting them in and then trying to get them out, or not letting them in? I
Right.
said we
Right.
have to consider the fact that if they come, we might have to say no to them. What would you like to do? And the priest said, Simon, if protesters come, we are going to say they're not welcome. I said, that is great. Okay, so when we say we're not welcome as a church, they're going to turn it back on us and say, are you refusing me
Oh yeah.
entry to this open door
Yeah.
church? And so what then happened, the scenario that you just played out then happened. These protesters arrived, we saw them forming. That priest stood on the door to the church, and what a brave soul this man was. He stood on the door to the church as the protesters came in with their cameras. I'm talking like professional grade doing cameras to
Right.
stream
Right.
live on Facebook and disrupt. He stood on the door and said, because I believe you're here to protest, you are not welcome inside these doors. And they used the line that I gave him. And they said, are you refusing us entry to this church? He said, I am, based on the grounds I believe you're coming here to disrupt, to disrupt our service here tonight. And then we then politely said to him, stand back, stand back. You're not being allowed inside the church. So the answer to your question really comes down to, Andy, in today's world, having that pre-planning that I mentioned earlier. What can go wrong? Could a protester turn up? And then having a conversation with the pastor and talking it through. Do you like what Simon just said? Do we say they're not welcome? Do we allow them in? If we've allowed them in, how difficult then is it to control them not getting on, our worship inside our worship stage, or getting into our areas? It's mostly better that we don't let them in. What does that conversation look like? So because we were proactive in our situation, Andy, it made it very easy, because that priest can then think through what's he going to say when he's in that moment, knowing it's being recorded and it's going to be streamed on Facebook. So yeah, real life scenario that you gave, and that's how we resolved it with his Episcopal Church.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, because denying people entry to a church, man, that can get controversial really fast.
Yeah,
And because, obviously Jesus was welcoming, but I think you spoke here about intent. And their
yeah.
intent was to disrupt. Their intent was to cause a
Exactly.
problem.
They weren't
Their
coming to worship, they weren't coming
right.
to listen, they were coming to disrupt. And so for that reason, that's why the priest felt comfortable to say that, you're not you're not coming for what we're here for, which is to lead people close to Lord, to be in community. You're coming with a sole intent of disruption. So you're outside of our boundary, as we mentioned earlier. Yeah, exactly, Andy.
Yeah, very cool. So Simon, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for, talking to us about not only protecting our congregation, but protecting ourselves out in public. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, so a lot of my personal handles are just my name at Simon Osamoh. If you are someone who is on a church safety team or interested in church security, I have my own podcast, which is called The Church Security Made Simple, where I just share some wisdom similar to what me and Andy have spoken through today. And I have a Facebook group, which is called the Worship Security Academy. I have an online collection of training courses for churches, and you'll be welcome to join my free group there on Facebook, which is called Worship Security Academy.
Very cool, Simon. Man, thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you for, seeing that this is a talent that you have and making this a part of your life, man. God bless you in your future.
Thank you, Andy. Take care.